Good afternoon and welcome again with this new webinar on new business models in times of crisis. My name is Leon Stille. I'm part of the Energy Delta Institute, and we are organizing this webinar together with the St. Petersburg International Gas Forum. It's part of a series of webinars, so this is the first one together with Bert Stuy, which is our senior expert and vice president of the Energy Delta Institute. So welcome, Bert. Good to have you here.
Pleased to be here.
So this is the first one on the new energy, the new business models that have arrived, I would say, from the crisis. And then we have two more webinars where we'll dive deeper into different subjects. Maybe just to start off first a little bit about our Energy Delta Institute, because of course this is mostly also for the Russian audience, so we're very happy to have you here. The Energy Delta Institute is a business school. So we do all kinds of energy education, from master classes to larger scale programs, where Bert also has a big role to play. And we are part of a broader organization called the New Energy Coalition, that is a network organization focused on different subjects like hydrogen, green gas, but also industrial transformation, North Sea energy, that kind of thing. So now you know who we are. Then I think we'll continue this webinar with Bert. If you have any questions, there are several ways you can view this webinar. So please do so in the chat function that is available on the different platforms that we are using. And I will see them here on the screen. And I will try to answer them or give them to Bert, and we will answer them together. So don't hesitate to ask any questions. Bert, can I give the floor to you?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Leon. I'm very pleased to be here once again. And also from my side, a warm welcome to people from all over the world, and particularly, I think, this time indeed from Russia. Very nice to have you in the audience. I always enjoy to visit Russia. I've been there many times. Always a joy. And let's move to the subject of today. I was asked to talk about new business models or business responses to the time of crisis we're in many ways. The global health crisis, which is now, of course, almost morphing into an economic crisis. It's an incredible time we are living in. Mm-hmm. And I think many companies, and notably also, of course, and that's what we're talking about today in the energy sector, will have to adjust to these new conditions. But if you do so, I think that's also one of the messages I want to bring out here today. There's already the content of my talk here, so that's very good. I think if you want to redesign and rethink your business model, obviously it is not only the crisis you have to contend with. You also have to realize what is, if you like, the broader movement this world is in. And I would argue that some of these underlying trends, which I would call the slow variables, will continue to shape the future. But they may be changed somehow because of the crisis of this year. So I'd like to, first of all, perhaps to say a few things about these underlying trends, these underlying changes which are taking place, where we already saw that many players in the energy arena, energy companies, were already adjusting to somehow. But then, of course, we live in unique times. There's no doubt about it. Very disconcerting times. So these slow variables, if you like, are now combined with the very, very fast crisis we've suddenly fallen into. It's now 5 or 6 months underway, if you like, and in many ways we don't even recognize the world anymore.
Maybe that's interesting. You had this talk in another webinar that you organized before, and it was a slightly similar topic, of course, but then we were still guessing, okay, what it is going to be, what will be the effect.
Absolutely.
Now we're 5 months further, so
that's right.
We have another talk about
that's right, and certainly although, to be completely honest about that, I think there's not even that much more clarity. I think one of the things which has become clearer is that where there was perhaps 3-4 months ago still some hope that it would be all over after the summer, although it was maybe a quaint hope, but that hope, it's very clear that that's not going to be the case. So it is a much more impactful full event as we perhaps hoped then. Anyway, we have these slow variables. The fast crisis, I'd like to say a few words about that. And then there's maybe also a brief reflection then as to how the transformation in the energy sector can be perhaps also a catalyst for the repair of the world. I mean, it's a restart, and can the energy sector be crucial in there? Yeah. And then clearly we want to focus a little bit on what have companies to do, because that's really also the topic today, the business models.
Also, that's something that we have more clarity about, you know, with all this money floating around the world, with all these green deals and things like that that are happening.
That's right. You see that
a good opportunity to go.
Yeah. Absolutely. You see that many of the countries which are formulating now the responses to the crisis which are there are indeed recognizing that an energy transformation could be part of the solution, and perhaps even, and some analysts argue that that is the case, would make the recovery not only cleaner, but also more robust and more beneficial for many. So let's say a few things about that. If we then, first of all, the slow variables, as I was saying. So yes, the next normal, if there's ever going to be any normal after Corona, can be radically different from what we believed the world to be 5 months ago. But you could also argue that some of the slow variables, which already started in the 80s and 90s, or maybe even before that, and I mean, some of these variables have already seen some crises, perhaps not as deep as this one, and they've continued to shape the world. So let's look at these. These are 5 which are very often brought forward. I'm not going to go through them in detail at all. Should you want to do that, there are TED Talks linked to each of them, and you can look at it a little bit deeper there. But the first one I would like to mention is what's sometimes called the race to the cliff. That it is not just a concern about climate change. It is a concern about the loss of biodiversity. It is a concern about the loss of freshwater resources. It is a concern about local pollution. All these come together, and each of these is already threatening the future of our civilization, to use big words there.
Maybe very, very recent is that in Siberia, at least, there's a lot of wildfires that were smoldering still over the winter, and now suddenly they flare up. It's the biggest disaster, I think, in...
Absolutely. I mean, when we were talking 3 months ago, still the memory of the Australian wildfires was still very, very fresh. In fact, they were concurrent with the fires elsewhere in the world. So that has an effect of climate, but very often also of other biological degradation of our planet. The second thing, which is perhaps a bit more hopeful, is what's sometimes called the great equalization, that we do see over the decades that the level of wealth all over the world is getting more equal. And you may sometimes think it's not the case, but even so it is true that the demand for energy resources, the demand for other resources all over the world is sort of merging together. At the end of the day, the amount of energy people need is the amount of energy a country needs depends on how many people live there, and not on whether it's in the south or in the north. I mean, that is the way it is moving. That provides challenges, because that makes the demand for these resources even higher. And a third movement, I think, I also can't see that stopping, although some people say that Corona may have some effect on that, is urbanization. So the move to the cities. Some people say that, you know, this densely populated areas all over the world are a catalyst for the spreading of diseases. So maybe there is some rethinking of urbanization, but I don't see it as yet. So
maybe a bit of a pause only. I think most people that were working from home figured out that if you have a small apartment in the middle of the city and you cannot go out, that's a bit of a problem. You would like to.
Exactly. I think that's been discovered now.
Yeah.
And then the other two, which are here, I think are obvious for all. That's the technological acceleration. We continue to move in an ever-accelerating pace on subjects like, clearly, artificial intelligence, biotech. These kind of developments are changing the world where we stand. And in the energy sector, for instance, that has meant that over the past 10 years, the cost of, for instance, new renewable energy technologies has fallen to 10% of the level it was just before. We may begin to see that also in the hydrogen space, but also in the more classical energy sectors. We see that also the radical cost reduction for shale gas, which have upset the world the last 10 to 15 years, all results of technological innovation. And the final one is the connectivity of everybody and everything. I think we all recognize that. Now, all of them have an effect on how energy businesses can view their own future. So if we think about the human pressure on the ecology, that means that climate and ecology will shape and constrain the way energy companies evolve. I strongly believe that in solving some of these challenges, there are new business models, particularly for the energy sector. So this is not necessarily a threat. Mm-hmm. It is also an opportunity.
Yeah, it may destroy some companies, but also reshape them or even build them up. Yeah,
and it's a call for changeability and agility, which also is very necessary in this time of crisis.
Yeah.
Obviously, the great equalization, so the upward pressure on energy and resource demand in itself obviously provides opportunities for energy companies, because somehow these needs have to be met, as long as it is in an ecologically sound way, of course. Mm-hmm. But that offers opportunities all over the world. Urbanization is one of the trends which changes the way energy companies operate. We have to begin to think about localization, decentralization, distributed energy systems, smart energy systems, which become possible because of the technology developments and the connectivity. I mean, so these sort of merge into one big trend of the global connectivity, urbanization. It all comes together. And energy companies, particularly, I think, end-use energy companies like the utilities, and in this area, we see this big rethink of how do you operate in this space. Yeah. Now, all this arguably has nothing to do with Corona, but in a way, it is already happening. Yeah. But it gets, in some ways, a further acceleration because of Corona. And in some ways, we may rethink some of these movements or fill them in a different way. And I'll come to that.
I think a nice example, perhaps you're going to tell us, but is like Tesla, for example. So if you look at the car industry globally, it's collapsed. So all of them need help except Tesla.
Yes.
For some reason, Tesla is bounced back up very quickly.
Yeah.
So electrical car sales have basically recovered pre-corona levels and even exceeded it.
Yeah, it's a very interesting example. You also sometimes see that in there is some concern. I'll come to that later about the weakness, if you like, of some supply chains, where this drives countries, but also sometimes individuals, towards a greater independence. And in that model, it may fit that you make your own energy yourself. Yeah. In your city, or perhaps even in your country. And that points to opportunities for maybe different energy companies than were dominant in the past. So you can see that some of these trends, which were already happening, get a new rationale because of Corona. Now, again, some of the emerging drivers, I'll be very brief on that because I've touched it. Sometimes called the 3D challenge. That's also a 3D challenge, a Rubik's Cube, but this one is even more complex, I would argue. That the energy sector, reflecting on all what is happening, decarbonization is almost like a shorthand of building business models which fit in the ecological parameters and sometimes, as I say, in the sustainable development goals. Digitization and data, which open up many, many possibilities for new business models. But some of the more settled companies find it sometimes difficult to translate the opportunities into their own business models, and they may be struggling sometimes more than others. We see, it's not the right parallel, but if you look at the financial world, for instance, where digital finance becomes very, very important, and it's the classical banks which find it very difficult to adjust to that, and they get suddenly competitors from elsewhere. The same we see in the energy sector.
You could even argue that for perhaps this Corona pandemic, well, not, of course, nobody wanted to have it, but now it's here. Because we are so far in this digitization, all these technologies, we are able to sort of get everybody keep working.
Get by, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Digitization helps us to survive. I'll come back to that later. Digitization is one of the areas which really gets an impulse from this crisis. Now, the last thing is decentralization, growing role of distributed energy systems, very often mentioned. Now, the interesting thing is whether that moves now, whether also that will be accelerated because of Corona, because of these concerns about long supply chains, and maybe the whole concept of globalization will have to be rethought in view of Corona.
1 second, that can you move your microphone a little bit further away from you?
Yes.
Or some,
sorry. Okay.
Otherwise you tap it sometimes.
I was too loud. Yeah. There we go. Now, of course, then, so, this was, if you like, the world as was. And I would argue in many cases also the world which is. And now this has been overlaid with these massive and fast crises, the Corona crisis, where everybody's talking about the new normal and the old normal, as if there's, there was a world before and a world after.
Yeah. Which still remains to be seen. Maybe the world after is almost the same as the world before. So
it could be. It could be. Yes, yes. And some of the aspects of new normal are very, very disconcerting, like keeping the social distance, which humans do not seem to be made for that. So it's true. Not. So, if you look at Corona, well, this image comes from the International Energy Agency. They have taken it from elsewhere as well, and I think this is all known. It's still, and that's very disconcerting, a near exponential infection growth. This picture actually shows how many people are now under some form of restraint, so they can't get out of their house. And I find that one of the most striking things which has happened because of this. It appears that the virus is to some degree contained in China, in East Asia, and Europe, but it's on a knife's edge, because it seems that if only a little thing happens, it can flare up. A second wave concerns, these kind of things are happening. But this I really found striking, and that's shown in this picture, which shows what kind of forms of restraint. So schools and universities are closed almost everywhere. Non-essential business is closed in many, many parts of the world. But in many, many parts of the world also, there was just almost a full or partial lockdown where people just couldn't go out anymore. So 1/3 of the whole population of the world is not allowed to go out as free as they could. Very difficult to get the exit strategies. That's also quite clear. And the societal impact in terms of what does it do to human well-being, I think it's still very, very high, very, very uncertain. And it's even as uncertain, I would say, as 3 months ago. It's uncharted territory. But then let's try and get this a little bit. So these things you read in the newspaper every day. And then there is beginning to some thoughts about what could that mean for how we've organized our economies and societies. And then we have to reflect on how that then relates to some of these slow variables I've mentioned earlier. So if you look at these subjects like globalization, in the old normal, I'm concerned about these terms, but I think we know what we mean. 2019, let's say, globalization was almost inherently good. If it was more efficient, just do it somewhere else. If it is cheapest to make things in China, we do it there. If it's cheaper in Vietnam, we move there. There was never any concern about this globalization. It was never, there was some concern, but not very, very sort of world changing. Then we see that perhaps the resilience of individual societies is revalued, and that we've seen it very strongly in the things we need for our health. And that's very clear. We suddenly found out that mouth masks were only produced on 2 or 3 spots in the world, and these supply lines were, or ventilators, and these supply lines were suddenly very, very thin. So will that mean that we get a localization of critical supply chains? And then as an energy sector, we have to ask ourselves the question, is energy then perhaps also one of the things where localization and resilience becomes once again more important than efficiency? If you look at the social paradigm, I'm frankly hesitant about that. I'm not sure where this will move, but some say that the dominance of market thinking in economy and society, what the markets do is the right thing, is in a way challenged because of this crisis. Because suddenly the markets turn out to be not able to solve these crises of such depth and such magnitude. And market principles are then challenged, and suddenly governments step in, or other institutions.
We like to have a bit of a strong government in times of crisis. It turns
absolutely,
out,
or at least a delivering government.
Yeah.
It's closely linked to that is the perception of public goods. There's been, particularly I think in OECD countries, a relative undervaluation of public services versus the private sector, and also an underpayment, I would argue. So the same quality of skills is better paid in the private sector than it is in the government sector. And I think, in a way, you now see a revaluation of these public goods. Suddenly, it turns out that those things which are provided, like education, like health, like keeping the whole thing running, suddenly becomes more important. Is that translated into different pay levels? I'm not entirely sure.
No, I think here in the Netherlands have been voted out of the second chamber 2 times, if I can remember correctly.
So arguably not. So whether indeed this public goods perception is robust still remains to be seen. In terms of mobility, I think we do see changes. I think everywhere in the world there is a shift in thinking about what is possible to do without transporting yourself. And of course also even the view we have on the necessity of flights and flying, etc., is being reevaluated. So I think one of the biggest impacts of this crisis will be on the mobility system. Yeah. Privacy, that's another thing, maybe not so hugely relevant for the energy sector, but I think privacy and freedom concerns so far were constrained by concerns about. So now we begin to see that people seem to be willing or forced to give up much more of their privacy than they would accept only 1 or 2 years ago. Yeah. We see this whole discussion everywhere in the world about apps which track your movements, and that can, where will this end? How far does government control go in a certain? I mean, do governments get a taste of keeping tags on people and then move it to other areas?
Although I think that maybe when we had this discussion 3 months ago, something like that, then indeed plans were in the Netherlands for an app, in the UK was an app and things like that. But all these apps have been
absolutely. So those constraints are still in place in some regions. I think that is not every. Not every.
In Asia, that's definitely not the case.
Absolutely. And then the final thing, I think that's almost all-encompassing, the values, where for a long time we thought that economic gain and profit were, if you like, a value in itself. But that's clearly not a value. Value has to do with care and those kind of things, which are sort of going a little bit deeper than and at least we suddenly discover that health is a value which which we are willing to even sacrifice our economy.
Yeah, but there are a significant amount of large company CEOs saying this same thing, that okay, yes, of course we need to make money, but in the end it's also a service that we provide for the public, and the public needs to be first.
Absolutely. And I think this is and also here, it's the same hesitation as many of these shifts, but this is an opportunity to recalibrate our values, at least to an extent. I mean, what is really important in life? At least being healthy is important, but perhaps also human connectivity in a physical sense is important. And we are losing that now, but we are losing it at great cost.
Yeah.
It is
increasing friction, I think, also.
Absolutely. If we then look at how to get out of all this, I think what is interesting, and then also making the bridge to the energy sector once again, is that somehow we will have to restart, to recover, to rebuild. And it is argued in this case, but I think it's happening in many places of the world now. This is the International Energy Agency together with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which say, well, we have to move to a sustainable recovery. In fact, today, the ministers of IEA countries are sitting together in a digital summit to discuss this report. I mean, is this true? And a few very interesting notions is that they, of course, it's clear that we now have a relatively low CO2 emissions. It's dropped by 8% in 2020 because we've completely stopped the economy of the world, if you like. You could argue it's even disappointing that it only drops by 8%. But you could argue, well, let's try and keep that lower level. and rebuild our economy whilst keeping that emission level low. And this sustainable recovery plan, where this is the cover of, can boost the global economic growth by 1.1 percentage points extra. We will see a global growth anyway if we come out of this crisis, but we can do more if we do it sustainably. We can create millions of jobs, and we can then perhaps see that 2019 was the absolute peak in the amount of emissions we have given out. Now, the interesting thing is, how much would that cost? And this is a very interesting figure. We see that already governments are spending trillions on economic recovery at this moment. The IEA argues that only 10% of that would be sufficient to realize this sustainable recovery plan with very, very significant impacts. And it's happening on these domains: electricity, efficiency, and other. So that seems rather obvious, but this is their image. So this is additional economic growth. Biggest impact, in fact, on emerging economies, but the whole world is benefiting, and even advanced economies do very good out of it. And you see there in this sheet that at this moment, jobs in the energy sector are at risk. We are losing jobs. The demand is dropping away. Prices are very low. New energy companies or renewable energy companies need investment money to operate. That investment money is under stress, maybe a little bit less than some of the other sectors, but it's happening. So we're losing, even in 2020, 10 million or 6 to 10 million of jobs. I think it's 7 on this chart. But more than that can be obtained if we follow this sustainable path. So very, very promising.
Which is basically a quicker pace than you would normally expect. Like I mentioned with the slow variables, they are there anyway. So we were on that path to some extent.
Exactly.
And now we can do it quicker.
Now we can do it quicker. And the governments are anyway set to spend trillions on the recovery of the economy. Then do it wisely and use a fraction, it's only a fraction of that, to stay on this course. And interesting for the energy sector is these kind of thoughts position the energy sector right at the heart of the recovery we have to go through. So I think it's a very interesting image. If you go in detail, it's also like a checklist. Are we doing the right things in our recovery plans? That's in fact what the ministers will be talking about today.
I think it's also a deviation from the beginning of the pandemic. Then we said, okay, the governments were scrambling, and then they said, okay, we keep the status quo. We just basically keep everybody fed and well and paid, and that's it. But now you see it takes too long. That means that we have to make choices because the economy has to adapt to the new situation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's, in some cases, there's also an acceptance that some sectors will shrink. It is impossible if, for instance, air travel goes down by maybe 30%. I'm just saying something that could be the new normal for the air sector for the coming 3 or 4 years. It is impossible to keep the same workforce in that domain. But then you have to ask yourselves, where will they then move to? Is that perhaps a resource for some of sectors which really need capacity, be it education, be it care? I mean, those kind of things we have to think about. And energy. And energy. Then we particularly look at the building sector, for instance. Those are the big things. Now, so that's very good news, I think, coming out of these respectable institutes. Then if you think about it from a company perspective, so this actually comes from McKinsey, so I'm very grateful for their thinking. They're actually very much on the ball at this moment on how should, of course, they see opportunities as a consultancy. And they've come up with these 5 R's. And that depends a little bit of where you are in the crisis, and that also depends on your country. Some countries were later into the crisis, or maybe survived the first part relatively well. One example is Israel, which did very well in the first phase, is now struggling. So countries are in a different phase. Of course, also the Americas were later than China, were later than Europe, now are struggling. So hopefully they will get out of it as well. And then the first one is, if this happens and your whole society is shut down in 2 weeks, survival becomes the first thing for you as a company. I think most of the countries are beyond that stage now, also for companies. They've gone through that phase. The next phase, which can last for weeks, is do you find sufficient resilience in your company? Are you agile enough to scale down rapidly, to make new priorities within your company, do the right things, and look at your money.
Yeah, get more money if you need it.
Can you even survive?
I think that's an interesting point as well, that some companies already had a very large debt burden.
Absolutely.
Were unable, or maybe now they are able only because the rules are not so stringent, but for the second package, third package, things like that, they will not be able to sustain themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. So that is what we see.
Good takeaway from this crisis, I hope, for future companies.
Yeah, be a little bit more balanced, more careful. Absolutely. Yeah. So we see that in the first weeks, and I think, to be completely frank, I think many energy companies have done very well because to keep societies running, even in this lockdown situation. Energy remains essential. Otherwise, our hospitals cannot run, and
cannot work from home.
You can't work from home. And I think in nearly all countries we've seen that, and that's, I think, a big compliment for the sector, that they have found ways to do that. Stretching themselves and kept the thing going. Also seen big losses in some areas, have accepted it to a degree, or even thinking now about saying goodbye to some parts of the business. And if we move a little bit longer, you have to look back at your value change and then get healthy at the right scale, because you have to begin to realize that some things will not get back to what it was in a hurry. And in some cases, you have to accept that your business will be 30% smaller, and how to do that. That is the period in where you want to return to how it was, but at the right scale and with the right priorities. Many companies are at this moment in that phase. I think we haven't seen very much yet of where we now should move to. That's why I put a circle around it. Is a reimagination phase, where you begin to assess, what world have we ended up in? How have these long-going trends merged with this strange crisis? What is that, a next normal? How many of these elements are robust and will stay with it? Have perhaps strengthened or accelerated trends which were there anyway? And which of these things will you may expect disappear in 1 or 2 in a year.
In how much time?
In a year or so, or 2 years, when somehow this pandemic will be brought under control.
It's interesting. You already mentioned the aviation sector, but I think a lot of these, the same goes, for example, for cruise ships as well. Is that apparently the first thing that they did now is to get rid of all the old assets. So all the big airplanes and big cruise ships from a long time ago is already polluting. So they should have been
anyway.
Out, but we keep them because of economic reasons. And now you see that the economic reason is gone, so we can get them out. So in that sense, you already have a win.
Absolutely. So we have to then, and that's of course ordinary business, you would say, but in a different context, where you weigh your business models, weigh your chances, and see where the threats are. I'll come to that a little bit later. And then after that, of course, and I think again, it's too much to ask, I think, for companies to be already very often in that stage. So we're talking then about, beginning maybe this fall or after, where we will see really a reforming of businesses, with investments, with divestments, merger and acquisitions, those kind of big tools to change the structure of your company. Innovation, of course, is going on, but innovation is slower than merger and acquisition.
Yeah, but also making choices in that sense. An interesting example I just came across a couple of days ago is Dominion Energy in the US. A big utility and gas company. They divested of their entire natural gas assets. So they basically focus only on the utility part, and then they sold the pipeline and storage capacity. But then the interesting thing is it's been sold to Warren Buffett, so the investment vehicle Warren Buffett. So apparently these two companies think of it in a different way. One of them feels, natural gas assets is not good for me anymore. But the other one sees an opportunity to actually step in that.
That's right. Sometimes it is difficult to reconcile two lines of business within one company, because it may be, I mean, this is a very simple example. If you're a consumer-facing company, it's important to get your gas as cheap as possible, to make it very simple.
Yeah.
But if you have those gas assets as well, it may be advantageous to get a high price. This is, of course, very simplistic. But,
but still,
these kind of tensions within a company can really make it impossible to get an innovative strategy on either of the two domains. And if it is then split out, sometimes a company which is far better in getting the full value out of the supply resources, be it gas, be it infrastructure, can do a lot better. And equally, the consumer-facing part of the company can become a lot more creative and a lot more radical in some of its solutions. So that's I think, actually, in effect, we've also seen in Germany with the big overhaul of the RWE and E.ON. They've sort of recalibrated their business portfolios over the past 3 or 4 years. Still not fully settled, but you see the same thing, that some things are not very comfortably together in one company. Anyway, so then how do you do that? And this is almost a little bit old-fashioned. There are, and I just mentioned 3. It's the old tools, I think, for any reality are applicable. And this is, I think,
the SWOT. We go back to the SWOT.
The old SWOT, swatting the trends. Look at what's happening. If you look at some of these, and I've just put a few of these things here, is that true? Are we moving from global efficiency to a local resilience in the energy sector? Is local resilience becoming much more dominant than the global efficiency? If that is the case, what are my strong points? If that is the move, what is my weakness, etc.? Is it indeed so that if I look at the next dynamic, that ecology and the sustainable development goals can be translated in an operational business driver? What kind of business models emerge from it? Am I positioned for that well? And what is the big risk if that would be happening? It's a bit old-fashioned, but the creativity is, of course, in picking the right things you really believe in will reshape your business. Is it indeed that market logic is less important and public interest becomes very important? How can you position yourself as energy sector, perhaps stronger than we've done in the past few years, as a public necessity? And obviously it is a public necessity, perhaps more than a way to make money. Can you add
all the values to your
absolutely
company
can you
only
add,
make money?
Absolutely, can you add values? And energy has plenty of opportunities to do that, but sometimes it was a little bit away and not in the interest of the shareholders, perhaps of the stakeholders, but not always of the shareholders. And indeed, I mean, this is a trend which, as we were just saying, it appears that digitization has got a very big kick in the back of this period.
So it would always be a shame not to step in there.
Absolutely. So this is the moment to capitalize on that change. And does it move even further? And then it becomes maybe a little bit more complex, that digitization is only the first step. I mean, do we move to artificial intelligence? What does artificial intelligence mean for how we design our energy system? Can it become even much smarter, as we always say, the smart energy system, which knows where the demand is, which knows where the supply is, which can balance these things, we can profit from price differentials, etc., where a human is not able to follow the changes. Can artificial
and the current grid as well is the current grid is not able to follow these changes. So perhaps that's also being implemented quickly.
Can it be overlaid with these kind of technology? And again, is your company able to ride that wave, if you like, or is it really a big threat for you as a company?
Maybe there's one question from the audience that's saying, okay, how do we prepare as a company? Probably, how do we prepare for the recovery phase after COVID-19? Do we have to take into account that there will be another crisis, another flare-up, or do you just think of it more according to these large trends?
I think that's an excellent question, and that is relating to this notion of next normal. Do you perceive the new world to be more resilient for crises like these.
Yeah.
And that could indeed mean that digitization has permeated even more the energy sector, so that it becomes in a way more agile, more flexible. And also the first one, that the local resilience of your energy systems and a somewhat lesser dependency. It's not a simple subject, by the way, because currently, of course, the energy chains, the resource supply chains are very long, be it gas, be it oil, be it coal, be it even biomass. So you can question whether that is resilient enough. But then if you move to systems which seem to be resilient, like I've got solar panels on my roof, or I've got a windmill in my garden, then you suddenly find out that the supply chains for these technologies are equally very, very long. In some cases dominated by China, in some cases dominated by the new low-wage countries, or dominated or determined by the availability of very scarce resources in that.
Which are also often not in Europe or the US, well, maybe US,
exactly,
but more in...
Exactly. So the resilience of these local energy systems is not necessarily a given. It is... and that means...
And there's always an element of doubt, or at least an element, not doubt, but an element of looking at the future that is uncertain. So whatever happens, you cannot really make this 100%.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely right. And that's actually the next thing.
Okay.
Very good bridge.
Good.
A very, very good bridge. So this is... and again, this is an equally old tool. And I think it's hinting on what you're saying there. Is build scenarios for a variety of possibilities, a variety of worlds, and maybe then try and design for your own company a strategy which survives in a few worlds, not in only one. It's not if you only can survive in a world where everyone is equal and where everything is sustainable, which I called here ecotopia, then that's okay. And perhaps I would like to live in that world. But as a company, it's also wise to prepare yourself for a world where perhaps the emphasis on equality is somewhat less, and can you also survive there? I've put some of these issues and some of these questions here on the sheet. We don't have to go through them, but I think we all understand that to identify the dynamics in this period of continuing trends and rapid changes, and get them clear enough to build a scenario around it is a big job, but is absolutely essential. And I agree very much with you. You have to prepare for a variety of worlds. It is
and be flexible to switch in these scenarios if you have to.
Absolutely.
I mean, of course, if the global world bans flying and you're an airplane company, that is going to be difficult. But some of these other things, there are degrees of freedom which you can take.
That's right. But even there, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned that. It's often said that the world of the early 20th century, so 1900 or so, the world was very connected. And that was not always for a very good reason. That had to do with all the colonies which were everywhere, all in the world. And there was a huge amount of personnel transport all over the world, all by shipping companies. But very few of these shipping companies actually were able to transfer themselves into an airplane company. Now, if we now get to a different way of connecting ourselves, be it, for instance, through digital instruments, you could argue that sometimes this digital connectivity is replacing the physical connectivity. But you can also see that it's very difficult for an airline company to be active in that new form of connectivity, like earlier in this century, to be active in this new form of people transport. Also turned out to be very, very difficult, much more difficult than you would expect. And it's these kind of...
viewing yourself more as a transport company of people, or transport of people company, and then you can choose all the options.
Exactly. And maybe now you should, perhaps even an airline should see itself as a connectivity company.
Yeah, something like that.
And then, I don't know. we do it there. So, but very important to prepare yourself for a variety of worlds. Then the third method, again, all these methods are old, true, and tested. But the challenge is to put out the right, or to recognize the right aspects you have to take into account if you're redesigning your company. Mm-hmm. This is another one also, and this is actually a little bit more about innovation. Because if you want to change as a company, very often the quickest way is investment and divestment. So you just, as you were just saying, this energy company, which suddenly finds itself to be more consumer oriented rather than commodity oriented, and they just sell part of it, and maybe they also buy a new company which is more consumer oriented. Yeah. But if you take the long view, it may also be that innovation is the way to move forward. And this is from Harvard Business School, and we don't have to go through that. But I think for any company, it is always important to try and strengthen their core abilities through innovation, so that at least you stay on top of the world in the area where you are already strong. Mm-hmm. And then from that you can build out to new markets, to new products, or even to something which you can't even dream of. Yeah. Now, if you then look 5 or 10 years hence, very often you find, if you've done it well, that your business is redefined based on innovations which seem to be out of the ordinary just 5 or 10 years ago. Yeah. There's even a lot of research on that.
Yeah. That's a good one. We had another speaker before in another webinar, Yusri Monduri, said that most of the innovation in a company is actually at the edge, so the fringe. So you have to be able to listen to the crazy guys,
absolutely,
that are on the edge of your company, because sometimes they're right. So your flexibility needs to be in that as well.
Very, very true. That will define your company, which the company as it will be in 5 to 10 years. But the challenge is that you also have to invest heavily in innovation in your core business. Otherwise, you're out of business even before you reach that 5 to 10 year period. So that's, I think, the call for balance. And sometimes that's also odd, but I very much agree with Yusri. If that edge is not there, mm-hmm. you won't be there in 5 or 10 years, many of them. So we saw this picture before, and I did a few things to it to look a little bit more at the energy sector. So, looking at these 5 horizons again, I think, as I already said, I think it's a big compliment to the energy sector that they have secured our energy supply in this time of very, very deep crisis, mm-hmm. That they've ensured safety, all these kind of things they've done it, or we have done it if you're part of that system. I think also many countries have found ways of to downscale some of their elements which were fitting with the changed demands in some areas. I think that not many companies are already in the phase of what we were just calling reimagination and the appraisal of the next normal. But it seems to be clear that things like digitization, decarbonization, and localization, or resilience, you could call it, will absolutely become cornerstones of what they have to contend with. And it's the old tools of scenario building, of swatting the trends, of portfolio build-ups, which really have to be revisited in light of what is happening at this moment. So clearly, the step beyond that, so changed innovation portfolios or in and divestments, are still quite scarce, but and merger and acquisition strategies. But I expect to begin to see that in this autumn.
There is a question related to that. There was a question also from the audience saying, okay, the majors, the oil and gas majors, they currently have a problem, so they're divesting also some of their assets. They're reducing the investments. Will that stop or slow down also the energy transition, because these big companies don't have any money?
Yeah. That is a very, very interesting question, and that looks on some models that you say, well, okay, the money that the majors make on their, if you like, their traditional portfolio allows them to move into the new area. That could be the case. To be completely honest, I think that the majors are at this moment not always the biggest catalysts and investors in the new energy systems which are emerging at this moment. Some of them are. Some of them have a big portfolio, and that will come under some threat. Although some companies, I should also say, is that when they are divesting from the upstream portfolio, are not divesting from their, if you like, new business portfolios. Yeah. That we see at least with some companies like Shell and like BP. At least that appears to be the case at this moment. Yeah. There was very recently, you may have seen it, the interview with the CEO of Shell, who argued exactly in this direction. Yeah. I'm not divesting there. No. I'm divesting here.
In the more traditional part. Yeah. Also, point 4, the reimagination is basically that part as well.
Exactly.
As an oil major, you may think, okay, now I still have a buffer left, so I can at least more quickly than I would normally do invest in this new type of business models, which are relevant for myself.
So it is a good question. I think, of course, financial weakness of any company makes it more difficult to prepare themselves for the future. That is true. But I expect to see movements there beginning this autumn or so. And I'm sure that in most of these companies, the processes of reimagination is at this moment already going. But the consequences will wait a little while. I think I'm coming to my final notions and observations. 2 sheets on that. And it sort of brings it a little bit together. Now, the first one is really an open door. The global economy takes a huge knock. I mean, there's very little debate about that. And on the one hand, that means that the energy sector needs agility and may have to scale down in a hurry because of low prices, low demand, and that is a very, very painful process. Always scaling down is never easy, and I think we have to be realistic that casualties in that process. That sounds a little bit chilly if you say it like that, but that will happen.
Yeah, they're already happening. Yeah,
we see it already happening, and perhaps some of the shale gas companies are examples of that, where this happens perhaps first. But actually, we can also see it in renewable energy. Then, and it's a bit more complex of why that is happening. You see there that renewable energy projects are very investment heavy, so much of the money has to be spent up front. You see that the financial strength of the project builders, project operators, or even homeowners or whatever who have to make the investments now are short of cash, and suddenly you see then also a drop down. For instance, in the Netherlands, I know that our organization for renewable energy is reporting that 30 to 40% of the companies are either have seen dramatic drops in orders, and about 25% is actually in current difficulties.
Oh, okay,
so,
really?
So it's not. This is not theoretical. So it's both the classical energy system and the new energy systems which feel the global economic knock.
It's quite interesting that another speaker I'm referring to all the webinars. You guys, you have to look at all our webinars. They're very interesting.
Look at it.
There's another speaker that said was focused on project finance, and he basically said, okay, if you look at project finance, actually, so how to finance these larger scale renewable energy technologies, they're actually fine.
Yeah,
because the low interest rate.
Yeah, and the long range
is still there.
And the long range. And I think that's true. And one of the so I think that's also a situation of this moment. So it was like a call to arms of this organization. Don't let that happen. Those kind of remarks. I think what is also true is that much of the investment in the renewable space depend to a degree on government investments.
Yeah, that's true.
And then we get to the next one, that rebuilding societies and economies requires energy. That's very clear, and that the energy sector can be part of the rebuilding. And that sort of harks back to the argument of the International Energy Agency. If you do it well, this rebuilding, not only does it require energy. Without energy, it's very difficult to build anything. But also energy can be a cornerstone of how you reimagine, if that we use that word again, the world after this. So in that sense, although there may be difficulties now, some of these companies can have a very bright future, I believe. Now, the third thing, and that's also, again, these are open doors. The crisis shows a global willingness. If there's a real crisis, then the world reacts. It reacts now, in fact, by shutting the whole world down. So that's quite something. But if that willingness is there to react when there's a real crisis, you would hope that the slower crisis, which is the ecological crisis, can at a certain stage also find a willingness to do something, if you like, perhaps even stronger than we've seen now, because the impact of the ecological crisis can be as big as the impact of COVID is now, of Corona is now. I've mentioned that there's an opportunity and emerging ambition for a green recovery, and the energy sector clearly is a part or even the heart of a recovery in that arena. That's also
just yesterday. The large European hydrogen strategy has been introduced, which is massive.
Exactly, the Green Deal, which was already designed before the Corona crisis, but has now been very strongly positioned as part of the European recovery plan.
It also creates, by the way, for the Russian audience, it also creates opportunity for other countries outside the European Union. So we require this kind of technology, this kind of green or blue hydrogen. That is also an opportunity for other countries to supply it.
But I think also for to be completely frank, I think the situation for if the economy is rebuilt, I can't see the demand for instance, gas dropping off in a hurry. I think that will rise as well.
Exactly.
So in these kind of green recovery plans, the first thing you see to be phased out is the brown coal, it's the black coal.
All the old assets, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. Sometimes even going maybe a step too far with biomass. Now, then
it's a unique discussion for the
that's a discussion which doesn't belong here. But so governments and public goods are revalued. Energy needs maybe a repositioning as a public necessity. It is obviously a public necessity, but has not always been perceived like that. The other ones I think have already touched upon, notably digitization, which has received a boost during the crisis. New business models are possible. And the final one is to me, one of the most complex one, and that is, what will this crisis do to globalization? I think that debate is far from over. We still need globalization. There's no doubt about it. But it may be that it has to be a different globalization. As they always say, there's deep concern that the globalization hasn't been fair to all in societies. So there is this element of resilience which may have been lost. There may have been this element of people losing out of the globalization, efficiency, fairness, efficiency as sort of highest value, which is also now challenged because suddenly it turns out that human well-being and health is maybe more important than efficiency. So those kind of things, difficult, but surely the energy sector can be part of the debate, at least, about how this will emerge.
Yeah, as being a sector that is highly global.
Absolutely.
So we have lots of experience in the globalization, but also how to sort of utilize it for the good things.
That's right. That's right. No, absolutely. And gas can never be, at least for us, no longer, cannot be local. No. Gas is almost per definition. But I think sometimes how far, for instance, renewables are local is sometimes overestimated because the supply chains are not local.
Behind it. Yeah, exactly.
And that's, I think, the last sheet.
Okay.
This is, the table is turned. That's, I think, an experience we all have with this Corona crisis. But what I'd like to stress here is that a turntable offers new opportunities. And that's just, you can say afloat on the turntable and not on one which is standing upright.
It's very nice. Thank you very much, Bert, for this. And it's also nicely on time. What I find very, very nice is because we had this same conversation before. Actually, one of your sheets is like the new normal and then before Corona. And we could almost make it in colors and say, okay, is it now red because it didn't happen? Is it orange because it's happening? Or is it green and it's really happening?
That's right.
Those kind of things.
Or red, we don't know. That's a lot will be red, I'm afraid.
But indeed, you see the resilience, the digitization, but also the change in business models. Those are the most important ones.
Absolutely.
Like what you said with, for example, aviation, things like that. Those will never be normal quickly. They have to be
that will take a long time, if at all. Yeah.
But for the energy sector is also an opportunity. And we can see, okay, how do we become ourselves? That's a very nice one that you said. How do we position ourselves in the middle of this recovery? I think that's already happening a lot, but that we can change with the public, for the public.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think you know, that you have to be careful not to sound cynical, you know. But these, to me, it's also clear that this crisis has underlined the importance of energy. Without energy, we would not have survived this crisis. That the revaluation of the public necessity which keep this world or societies running, that energy is right at the heart of that. That digitization and other things offer new opportunities also for the energy sector, and that energy can be a cornerstone of a green recovery. So all in all, it's a sad situation in the world, but it's not necessarily so that this doesn't provide perspectives for the energy sector.
Okay, thank you very much. I think with this we can slowly go out with this webinar. Thank you again, Bert, for joining us here and having this nice conversation again. If there are any other questions, there are not so many, but if you still have questions, you can always email us and ask us, and then I will give them to Bert to answer them. So this concludes this webinar, and next week we'll have another webinar planned, the second one in a series of 3, and that will be about carbon capture and utilization. I will do that one myself as an expert for, so that's new. Normally I'm sitting here talking, then I still have to talk, but then somebody else does the moderating, which is also good. So then I will hopefully see most of you again next week, and have a good day.